This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, welcome back to the very end of the year. And so at the end of the year, we do all of our best of episodes. So hopefully last week you listened to our episode with the best books of 2023. And today we are getting into the best podcasts of 2023. Before we get there, guys, leave a review and share this show. So guys, if you want to know how this show can get out to other people, the easy way to do that is to just share it. And so if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anything else, there's always a share button. Share this around. Don't keep this a secret. And also leave us a 5-star review. If it's 4 stars or below, just move on with your life. I don't really understand people that leave 2 and 3-star reviews. It's like, why in the world would you do that? Just move on and go find something that's better for you. So make sure you go ahead and do that. And guys, we are right in that season. I'm sure you've been getting hit up with a lot of emails, maybe even one from me, about end of year giving, your year-end giving. So please keep Undaunted Life in mind, because if you don't know this by now, you should, but we are basically donation-based. So we get a little bit of money from advertising and other revenue sources, but the overwhelming majority of how we keep the lights on at Undaunted Life and how we're able to keep bringing this content to you is because we have donors. We have one-time donors, and then we have guys that hop in on a monthly basis. I mean, as small as $10 a month on all the way up from there. And so guys, end of year giving, keep us in mind. And want to remind you to treat yourself with amazing American content and products, maybe not content, products like Origin and Jocko Fuel. So guys, if you don't know this by now, we are also an ambassador for those two brands. So Origin makes the best jiu-jitsu gis on the planet. They also make jeans and boots, outdoor gear. They've got these brand new pants. They've got the hunting gear. All that's on the Origin side. And then on the Jocko Fuel side, they've got the Go energy drinks. They've got the greens. And I wanted to take a little quick aside to talk about the greens, because I don't eat a whole lot of greens in my diet. I eat mainly meat. And so that one scoop of greens that I get from them, not only is it the best tasting greens that I've personally had that's on the marketplace, but I just throw that in my protein shake as I go off out the door to go pick up the boys. And it's amazing. I get my greens in, I get all those micronutrients. So guys, you can check those two sources out, those two brands out. The links are in the show notes. Getting a little tongue tied, but use the promo code Undaunted. Okay. So if you can find our show, you can certainly plug that in. Use the promo code Undaunted to get 10% off. Basically, you get 10% off, and that 10% goes to support what we're doing here at Undaunted Life. So here we are, another award show. I'm excited. The thing about these award shows is I think about these literally all year long, because as I'm reading certain books or as I'm listening to shows or as I'm preparing our own podcast, I'm thinking, okay, is this going to have what it takes to be part of the award shows at the end of the year? And so this is how we do the best podcast episode. So I'm going to give awards to other shows, not Undaunted Life of Man's podcast things, but I'm going to talk about random can't miss episodes, favorite new podcast of 2023, the best podcast show overall of 2023, and the best podcast episode of 2023. Then we're going to talk about Undaunted Life of Man's podcast, okay? And so this is going to be a little bit of a shorter episode today, so you guys can go back and listen to some of the episodes from Undaunted Life from this year, but also from some other shows. Before Undaunted Life of Man's podcast, we're going to do the hardest interview to prepare, the hardest episode to prepare, the most offensive episode, the most talked about interview, the most talked about episode, the interview I was most nervous about, the episode I was most nervous about, the audience's favorite interview, and then audience's favorite episode, my favorite interview, and then my favorite episode. So you might be wondering, well, Kyle, aren't interviews episodes? Yes, but I'm basically giving the interview episodes its own category, and then everything else that's not Forging Table, so all my solo episodes, those are just normal episodes. So before we get into that, I need to tell you guys how you can listen to more podcasts. And I remind you guys about this all the time, but a lot of you listen to podcasts at one-time speed, and I don't understand why. Because your brain can hear and grasp and digest things way faster than you feed it, okay? And so some of you're like, wait a minute, I can't even do 1.5 speed. 2x speed seems crazy, especially for guys like you that talk so fast. But I guarantee you, test me in this, spend the next week with your podcast player, whatever podcast player you use, and do it at 2x speed. Because the thing is if I talk at my normal cadence, this is my normal cadence, and this is how fast I talk. But if I bump it up to 2x speed, you can still understand what I'm saying, because your brain is basically taking the words that you need to digest, and it's going to leave them in your brain, and then you're going to move on and you're going to get to the content that you need, right? So if you're already listening to this at 2x speed, that was 4x speed, but you get the idea. Also, don't listen to crappy podcasts. So I don't know if you're like me at all, but I'm the type of guy that even if the book sucks, I have to finish it. Even if the movie sucks and it's boring, I have to finish it. Even if the meal's not great, I have to clean my plate. But with podcasts, if you've gotten 15 minutes into a podcast or a couple episodes into a particular new podcast and you don't dig it, Unless it's our show, you should listen to our show no matter what. But if it's somebody else's show, just don't listen to those. And also move on from a podcast after you feel like you've gotten the point. So there are certain podcast episodes from certain podcasters that I will leave nameless, but they may do an hour-long show, but you get the point after about 10 minutes. It's like they're going to spend the next 50 minutes just kind of repeating the same thing that they've said, the same point over and over. And you don't really need to spend the next 50 minutes of your life, logged into the exact same point. And also do podcasting every chance that you can. So your normal downtime. So I have these little things right here, these Apple AirPods. And so I put these in, and basically if I'm sitting, waiting for the boys to get out of school, I'm listening to podcasts in the truck. If I'm walking the dog and it's just me and the dog, I have these AirPods in. I don't listen to music when I work out. I'm kind of like a serial killer in terms of how that goes. But in between sets, I'm listening to podcasts on my Bluetooth speaker. So you can find times to do things during your downtime when you don't need to be thinking and concentrating, where you can listen to other people's words. So that's a way for you to get some more podcast work in for 2024. Now, I'm also going to go into my lineup because a lot of people are like, so what podcasts do you listen to? So before we get to the awards, I will go into that. Now, I'm not going to put links to all of these in the show notes because I know some of you guys listen on different podcast platforms. So I'll just put this list in the show notes so you guys can check that out. And also, if I mention a show here, this is considered an endorsement of that show, obviously, but I don't fully support everything that is said by every person on every episode of each of these podcasts, because that would be insane. And so if I suggest somebody and you're like, oh, they said that one thing back in 2012 and I didn't like it. Okay, I'm just saying in general, these are shows that I like. So I have 3 new shows. I've kind of, rotated a bunch of shows this year, but the 3 new shows that I've added this year that are kind of in heavy rotation are the Jack Hibbs podcast. He's a pastor out of California. Mike Force podcast. That's Mike Glover's podcast. And Huberman Lab. That's the Andrew Huberman podcast. And then here are the podcasts that I basically don't miss. I can't miss them. I don't miss them. I won't miss them. The Briefing with Albert Mohler, Cooper Stuff with John Cooper, The Ben Shapiro Show, Morning Wire, PragerU 5-minute videos, Fireside Chat with Dennis Prager, Bill Burr's Monday Morning Podcast, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, and Deepen with Pastor Joby Martin. And I also listen to I'll go to the next category here. So the next category here, these are consistent listens. I listen to almost every episode. So the first 2 are Church of 1122 and the Village Church. That's Joby Martin and Matt Chandler. I say that I am a consistent listener of those because as long as those guys are preaching, I'm going to listen. But if it's anybody else, I'm not going to. So that's not me being a hater, but it's like, look, I don't have that much time to listen to everything that I want to listen to. And so very rarely have I heard like a guest preacher at one of those places. And I've been like, man, I'm really glad to listen to that. So I basically just skip those. I also consistently listen to the Just Thinking podcast with Daryl Harrison and Virgil Walker, the Matt Walsh Show, the Jordan B. Peterson podcast, Jocko Unraveling with Jocko Willink and Daryl Cooper, the Joe Rogan Experience, The Breakdown with James Langford, and the Mark Driscoll podcast. Well, actually, we're going to go to the next category, which is the Here and There podcast. And so I'm actually going to put the Joe Rogan Experience down there because I do skip quite a bit of his. I probably listen to 1 for every 4 or 5 that he posts, because if he has another comedian on there that I don't know or don't like, that's going to be 3 hours of them just, talking about random topics. So that's a Here and There. Some other Here and There's are the Sean Ryan Show, the Chad Prather Show, Unashamed with Phil Jason Al Robertson, Jocko Podcast, Danger Close with Jack Carr, Mic Drop with Mike Ritlin, The Way I Heard It with Mike Rowe, Art of Manliness podcast with Brett McKay, and the Lex Friedman podcast. So if I'm missing any, I just gave you a whole bunch there. If I'm missing any, if there's ones that I absolutely need to be listening to, let me know. So if you're on social media right now, shoot me a DM or leave me a comment or shoot us an email through our website. But without further ado, we are getting into awards time right now. So let's talk about other shows. I'm going to give you a list of some random can't miss episodes. And again, these will be in the show notes, so don't pull your car over or try to furiously find these while you're driving. That's stupid. So here are some random can't miss episodes. I'm not going to tell you why, just trust me. So for the Joe Rogan Experience, episode 2055 with Tim Kennedy, 2054 with Elon Musk, 2043 with Francis Foster and Konstantin Kisin, 2027 with Oliver Anthony, 2024 with Hulk Hogan, 2008 with Stephen C. Meyer, 2004 with Ice Cube, 1987 with Jelly Roll, and 1933 with Jordan Peterson. Now, here are some can't miss episodes of the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. 402, Who is Ron DeSantis? 354, A Conversation About God with John Lennox. And then I'll skip the titles. I'll just say who's on it. 385 with Willie Robertson, 382 with Oliver Anthony, 373 with Andrew Doyle, 372 with Jim Caviezel and Tim Ballard, 371 with Eric Metaxas, 361 with Senator Josh Hawley, 360 with Dr. Peter Attia, 347 with Miriam Grossman, 343 with Rafe Kelly, and 335 with Christopher Rufo. Now for the Ben Shapiro Show, I've got a couple of episodes, Ben Shapiro versus University of Cambridge from November the 5th, and What Does It Mean to Be a Man? That's his short interview with Vodi Bakum on July the 30th. For PragerU 5-minute videos, there's What's Wrong with Marijuana from December 4th, Sex is Binary from September 18th, How Dangerous is Nuclear Waste from July 24th, What Are Judeo-Christian Values from May 29th, got a little burps coming up all of a sudden, and then Lying Liars from March 13th. For Art of Manliness, I've got Protein, Everything You Need to Know from October 23rd, Cormac McCarthy, The Road and Carrying the Fire from June 19th, and What the World of Psychology Gets Wrong About Men from April 10th. Then on Mike Rowe's podcast, I've got 351 bonus story, Rough Delivery. That's from October the 12th. 345 bonus story, Enough, and 332 bonus story, His Final Destination. For Jocko Podcast, I have episode 402. That's his interview with Bo Nickel from September. Then we've got the Matt Walsh Show. I've got his August 16th episode 1206, called Traditional Masculinity is the Solution to the Male Loneliness Epidemic, Not the Cause. Then I've got the Village Church Sermons. That's Broken Covenants from August 13th. Purpose from June 18th, and Awake to Truth from February 21st. And then on the Church of 1122 podcast, I'm just going to say that you need to be listening to all of these because, again, of course, you guys know that Joby Martin's my buddy, but he was just on fire all year. And so I was like looking through the ones that I thought were, memorable and things that we should listen to. That's just one that you should be consistently listening to if you're going to listen to one pastor. Okay. Now, we're going to get into my awards here. So my favorite new podcast of 2023. So that's new to me, not new in general. That's the Mike Force podcast. And so for those of you that know, a lot of you came over here because of that podcast, because I was on that show in Utah here just a few weeks ago, and it was a tremendous experience. But what Mike Glover is doing out there in Utah with Fieldcraft Survival is incredible. So not only is the headquarters amazing, but he's teaching Americans what they need to do in case the worst case scenario happens. That's why he wrote the book Prepared. That's why he does preparedness classes. That's why he sells preparedness gear. And he continues that in those types of ideas and those philosophies through the Mike Force podcast. So he does some solo episodes, and then he does some interviews similar to what I do with my show. So that is my favorite new podcast of 2023, the Mike Force podcast. Now let's get into the best podcast show overall of 2023, and that's the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. I thought that he was on fire this year. As you could tell, I gave you a bunch of can't miss episodes, but I would say from wire to wire this year, it was the highest quality podcast that I saw. There were some interviews that just weren't that interesting to me, so I either skipped them or didn't listen to them all the way through, but he just consistently had these amazing guests on. My one complaint about his show would be this. I do not know who's helping him with the editing or the production of his show, but as many of you know, we will insert ads into our show. And so basically in between thoughts or in between sections of my podcast, we will insert an ad break that a company can purchase. And it might be an ad for, a credit card or some sort of car or something like that. But whoever does the insertion of his ad breaks, they just do them randomly. And so he or his guest will literally be in the middle of a sentence or, in the middle of a word, and he will just, it'll just cut out and go to an ad. And sometimes the ads are in Spanish, and it's just very, very strange, and it's very, very frustrating. And some of the ads are 60 seconds long, some of the ads are 15 seconds long, and it's just so super random. So if anybody knows who's helping him at the Daily Wire with the show, please, please, please start putting those breaks in between thoughts or in between questions. That would be great. But overall, the content is just fantastic. The best podcast show overall of 2023, the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. Now we've got the best podcast episode of 2023, the best individual episode, and that is episode 1824 of the Ben Shapiro Show, called The Face of Absolute Evil, and that was released on October the 9th. So this was 2 days after the Hamas attacks in Israel, and the thing about this show is everyone that knows or knows Ben Shapiro knows that he is an Orthodox Jew. He wears the yarmulke. He's just he's very Jewish, obviously, but he's very Jewish even in his philosophies, and he brings his Jewish ethics and morality into the things that he discusses from a conservative political viewpoint. And so a lot of people were interested in what his reaction would be to the Hamas attacks from October the 7th. And I will say that as I was this is one of the few ones that I watch because I basically listen to podcasts. I don't watch them. This was one of the few that I made sure I watched on YouTube because he very calmly and coolly gave all of his very, very well thought out thoughts on what happened, on the state of Israel, on the state of the relations with Hamas, what Israel as a country should do, what individual Israelis should do, and what, frankly, the rest of the world should do as they looked at it. And the thing that I appreciated the most is he didn't pull any punches. So he showed a lot of video and a lot of pictures of the worst atrocities that happened. And as time has gone on, we've heard more and more about the atrocities, but he was showing women who had been brutally raped and they were, bloody from being penetrated so violently so often. Decapitated heads, women and children that were shot through the head. He showed all that on his show. And to be honest with you, I was frankly shocked that it was able to be put on YouTube. They did have a little bit of a disclaimer there at the beginning, but it was a very sobering episode. Again, that was, within 48 hours of the attacks. And so everything was still really, really fresh. And I just appreciate how he approached it. Same way that I approached it on my show, which is we're not going to sanitize anything. And his reasoning was the same reason for mine, which is in very short order. So in very, very short order, there were going to be people that were going to be advocating for a ceasefire. Because people are just going to focus in on, what's Israel doing and why are they messing up and why are they being so mean and why are they this and why are they that? And they're going to forget entirely about what Hamas had done. And that's the reason why as I hear about new stories that I make sure that I bring those stories to you. Because here recently we've heard stories about women that were so unbelievably brutally raped, their pelvises were destroyed. Think about how hard and how long you have to rape a person, a girl or an adult woman, to break their pelvis. I mean, just think about that. What would you have to do to pull that off? And so, again, I really, really appreciated how he approached that episode. It was a very difficult episode for him to record. It was a difficult episode for everyone else to even watch and listen to, but it was basically required. And so if you have not listened to episode 1824 of the Ben Shapiro Show, it's called The Face of Absolute Evil from October the 9th. That is on his YouTube channel still. So I would definitely suggest that you go back and do that. All right, let's shift gears from other shows to our show. So I spent a lot of time thinking through these and looking at all of our data and everything. So let's launch right in. So the hardest interview to prepare of 2023, that was episode 473 with Benjamin Watson, where we talked about his new book, The New Fight for Life. So if you listen to my best books of 2023 podcast, I talked about the worst book of 2023, and I gave it to Benjamin Watson in The New Fight for Life. And I talked about my consternation with that because I like Benjamin Watson personally. He and I are friends. We are friendly with one another, but I just couldn't get over how bad the book was argued and how poorly he delved into the most important parts of the pro-life cause. And so I'm not just going to do a complete rehash of that, but the reason why it was so hard to prepare is because I thought about canceling the interview. But I wanted to honor him. I wanted to honor the place on my schedule, because one thing I can't stand, this happened to me recently. You do all this preparation for a podcast and then somebody just cancels it. Like, I had someone cancel within 24 hours of the podcast, and I can't undo the level of prep and the hours I've spent with that person's content. So it's really rude. Now, it's different on the other side because you don't really have to do anything to prepare for an interview. But if I say I'm going to do it, I'm going to follow through. I can count on one hand the number of times that I've had to shift and move somebody around. But I thought about not doing the interview. I talked to some of my confidants about what I should do, because there were very few things I was able to find in the book where we were going to have deep levels of agreement. But we did agree on the core things, which is that people need to repent of their sins and turn to Christ for their salvation, and that people should protect life in any way possible, right? Well, I won't say in any way possible, because that's where we do differ, but to, in general, protect life, to protect innocent, living human beings. But it was a very, very hard thing to prepare for, because I was like, look, I don't want to just flame him the entire time, because that would be rude. But at the same time, I don't want to leave some of his most ridiculous comments and arguments from the book unchecked. And so I did focus more on what we agreed on when we got into that interview, and I did push back a little bit, but that was certainly the hardest interview to prepare for 2023. Now let's go into the hardest episode to prepare for of 2023, and that was episode 518, Let Those Who Love the Lord Hate Evil. So this was my episode that I did concerning the Hamas attacks in Israel. And the reason why it was the hardest episode to prepare is because I did not shy away nor look away from the images and videos that were coming out, that most of which were shot by Hamas fighters because they were super proud of what they had done. And so for that entire week that I was preparing this episode, I was literally marinating in pictures and videos and written descriptions of men, women, and children being violently, brutally raped, murdered, tortured, all of that. And I'm literally sitting here because I prepare my podcast right here where I record. And at different times, I was like angry crying as I was going through my notes. I was so angry at what these Hamas pieces of garbage did to these innocent Israelis that it was just overwhelming me with emotion. I let a few guys in on that, and I kind of reached out to them and, kind of vented my frustration. But it was just one of those weeks where I really needed the powerlifting in my garage gym. I really needed the jiu-jitsu to just help me control my emotions. And I was a bear to be around. I had to apologize to my wife several times, my kids several times, because I would just like snap and have these really big, angry, immediate reactions to little nonsense things. And it was because I felt like I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I literally felt like my soul was being like mushed and smushed and just crushed. And it really was soul crushing. And, I reached out to some friends after I finally did the podcast and after I taught my Sunday school, because I did both of those things in the same week on that content. And I just needed to get it out of my brain. But it was just like, it was such a hard week. It was one of the hardest weeks that I've had of the entire year. And it was because of that content, because when you look at depravity, it's a very difficult thing to do. But one thing I tell you guys all the time is I'm here to equip you to push back darkness, right? I try to encourage you to push back the darkness that you see around you and the darkness in society. You can't do that if your eyes are covered. You can't do that if your ears are plugged. And so part of what I do is I spend a lot of time in those dark places looking at dark things, so that I can prepare you for what will befall you potentially if you decide you want to go full bore into the fight. So it wasn't the easiest thing to do, but it's something that had to be done. Hardest episode to prepare of 2023, episode 518, Let Those Who Love the Lord Hate Evil. Now, let's get into the most offensive episode of 2023. That is episode 426, called The Ugliness of Gay Adoption and Surrogacy. So, obviously, via our culture, whatever gay people decide to do is supposed to be just fine and moral. So, if they want to bang each other, fine. If they want to have an open relationship and bang a bunch of dudes, fine. If they want to adopt kids, fine. If they want to mail order babies from certain mothers and swirl their sperm together and have it, combined with an egg and then insert it into some random woman that they pay tens of thousands of dollars to carry their baby around so that they can have an accessory to carry around a child, fine. That's what culture tells us. But there's nothing beautiful about gay adoption and surrogacy, nothing at all. And in that particular podcast, I talked about these two gay men that adopted these two brothers, and they were systematically raping and destroying those boys, and also pimping those same boys out and selling them to their gay pedophilic friends. Now, obviously, every gay couple is not going to act out in that way, but it's certainly an issue, is it not? So in that episode, I talk, deeply about that particular case, but then I just talk about the ugliness of gay adoption and surrogacy overall, because children deserve a mother and a father. That doesn't always work out because we live in a fallen world. We live in a post-Genesis 3 world. Sometimes mom dies during childbirth. Sometimes dad's a deadbeat and not there. Sometimes things don't work out. People die. There's the myriad of situations that would lead to a child not having a mother and a father, but that is the design. And so this idea, and here's the other thing. I've had a lot of people get mad at me here recently, and okay, get mad. I don't really care. But people are like, why are you so mad about gay people adopting babies? But what they're talking about is gay people paying a surrogate to carry their lab-created babies and then steal them from the woman on the back end, to rip them away from their mother. Literally, the baby comes out of the woman. They don't even let it, sit on the woman's chest, and they just basically clean the baby up and take it over to these gay fathers that are sitting in a hospital bed as if they just got through giving labor. It's disgusting. It's horrific. It's satanic. Like this idea that we're allowing gay men that are living in this unbelievable, filthy, depraved sin And to welcome children into that without their mother even being around, it's horrible. But again, I say that and I'm a bigot. I say that and I just don't understand. I say that and I'm just being way too judgmental. But again, why would we even allow, as a society, the creation of a baby specifically to bring them into a homosexual household? Because again, something may end up happening and they don't get access to mom. But in this, we're allowing them to just take these babies, again, as an accessory piece, and we're just supposed to act like it's okay. So I did that one earlier in the year. My opinions haven't changed. If anything, they've gotten deeper. But the most offensive episode of this year, episode 426, The Ugliness of Gay Adoption and Surrogacy. Now let's do the most talked about interview of 2023. And that was a recent one, episode 527 from the Senate with Mark Wayne Mullin of November of 2023. So if you go back to that time, Mark Wayne Mullin went viral for challenging this, Teamster leader to a fight right there on the, Senate hearing floor. And we saw the viral thing where he stood up and he said, stand your butt up then, and, had to be kind of, chilled out by Bernie Sanders of all people. The funniest thing about that story, for those of you that are new to the show, he came on my show about 90 minutes after that happened. So he literally goes viral. I get a message from one of our guys here. It says, hey, did you see this about Mark Wayne? And then I look at the clock and it's like, 45 minutes later, he's going to be on our show. So that day he only did Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast, and one of the shows on Newsmax. He said no to all other news things. And so I was literally the first person to talk to him about that in a public setting. And I released the episode that day. The reason why it's the most talked about interview of this year is because that little clip from that show made the rounds. So all the late night shows, Fallon, Kimmel, they showed a clip from that show where he said, and hey, I'll bite somebody, like during a fight, which was the only thing he said sarcastically of the entire show. And all these dum-dums took it as if he literally meant it, even though he had a huge smile on his face. And so did I. I think it made the Oliver, whatever that guy, that British guy who pretends to be smart on HBO, the Super Late Show or whatever that thing's called. But it literally, that clip went everywhere. It went bananas on Twitter. It was all over TikTok and all that. So without a doubt, it's not even close. The most talked about interview of our show this year is episode 527 from the Senate with Mark Wayne Mullin. All right, next one, the most talked about episode of 2023. And that was episode 423 called Andy Stanley is a Heretic. And so many of you that have listened to the show this year, I've done 3 entire episodes just on Andy Stanley. But if we go all the way back to the beginning of the year, I think this was released in January or February, is whenever I first really wrapped my head around the fact that Andy Stanley is pro-LGBTQ, that he does not see it as a sin, and he's not going to talk about it from the pulpit as if it is a sin. And then we move through the rest of the year. They do that conference, that LGBTQ plus affirming conference. They have ridiculous things that were said from there. Obviously, you can just go back and listen to the episodes I did. I'm not going to rehash it here. But that was easily the most talked about episode because people were just completely unaware that Andy Stanley thought this way and did these things. A lot of people were maybe like I was to where, they listened to him, religiously, no pun intended, for a really, really long time. And then maybe they just kind of fell off. They got distracted and they were listening to other preachers or something like that. And so they had no idea that Andy Stanley had gone off the deep end and become basically a progressive Christian. And again, some of you are like, wait a minute, you can't call someone a heretic. That's crazy. That's a crazy high charge. But basically a heretic is just somebody that consistently holds to opinions that are outside of the accepted doctrine of their faith that they purport to be a part of. And so from the pulpit, when he says the things that he says, it's very damaging. And then also we can look at it this way. He's very much like Pope Francis in that he never speaks clearly when he's talking about this issue. He's such a master communicator. He is his own PR spin team. That's basically what Andy Stanley is, which makes him so dangerous. Because how hard would it be to say, yeah, if you act out on your homosexual desires, that's sinful. You can't live with a same-sex person in a same-sex relationship. You certainly can't get married. It's bad if you have kids. It's all bad. But he would never say that. Same thing on the trans idea. He's gonna be one of those guys within a few years. He will come out as completely trans. Maybe trans identifying, but he'll come out as pro-trans, saying, yes, that is your accepted identity. We're going to go with that. He's going to use pronoun hospitality, the whole deal. And you guys have really hopped on board. And it's really done a lot for people to really wake up and say, look, your favorite pastors may have written books that you liked. They may have preached sermons that were fantastic. They may have done things that have helped you. They may have even brought you to faith. But that doesn't mean we just blindly follow them for the rest of our lives. We have to keep paying attention to the things that they're saying, the things that they're doing, and how far they're straying away from the Bible. So most talked about episode of 2023, episode 423, Andy Stanley is a heretic. Now, the interview that I was most nervous about of 2023, this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, was the interview that I did with Vodi Bakum. So that was episode 505 called Vodi Bakum, Discovering the Ever-Loving Truth. And so I've been trying to get Vodi Bakum on the show for like 3 or 4 years. And, I'd worked with different publishers, different managers, different friends of his, and his team behind the scenes is I'll just say they're not the easiest people in the world to work with. But we got in, we had a very specific time crunch, and he had a book coming out at a particular time, and I reached out at the right time to the right person, and it just worked out. And I'll just be honest, I'm not like, flexing or anything, but I really don't get nervous before interviews. I don't even get nervous before I speak live, because it's like, I kind of remind myself, this is what you were put on this planet to do. So whether I'm speaking at a prison or at a men's event or at a larger church event, it's just like, all right, these are just people. This is just a microphone. This is just the words I need to say, or these are the words that God is going to say through me. Ready, set, go. I do the same thing with interviews, but I was feeling the weight a little bit of this one to be like, gosh, I've literally wanted to get this guy on for forever. He's one of my favorite guys to listen to, one of my favorite pastors, one of my favorite preachers to preach. I don't think he's technically a pastor anymore, but he's one of my favorite guys to hear preach the gospel. And I was just so excited to talk to him about the things that he had done, the things that he had worked on. And, I wish the audio quality had been higher, but he was in this, hotel room where the audio was bad. And, the microphone or his in-ears were, they were like rubbing against his beard. So there was a little bit of friction, and we did what we could to make the audio as good as possible. But I don't think any of y'all noticed unless you're an audiophile. But I was very, very nervous going into that, or I was slightly nervous, I could say, but I couldn't have been more pleased with how it went and how he and I connected. So that was the interview I was most nervous about of 2023, episode 505 with Vodi Bakum. Now we need to talk about the episode that I was most nervous about of 2023, and that was episode 496, The Dangers of Country Music Theology. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, Kyle, why would you be nervous to talk about country music and make up a phrase called country music theology? Well, that really wasn't it. That was my first recording after I was back from vocal cord surgery. So I had 2 vocal cord surgeries, which I'll talk more about in my year-end wrap-up. But for those of you that didn't know, I had a collapsed vocal cord, 1 surgery, didn't fix the issue, had to go in and do surgery again. And then I took several months off of doing like consistent recording. I would do interviews where I could talk for a second, tee them up, and then let my voice rest. Forging table where I could talk for a second, tee up the other 3 guys and then let my voice rest. But episode 496 was the first episode where it's like, okay, this is just me. I am back. I'm going to do my larger topic at the beginning, and then I'm going to do my quick hitters. And I did it. And part of the thing that, I was most nervous about is because I had spent months and months thinking about these ideologies about country music theology, about this idea that, if you listen to country music and if you are from the country and if you vote Republican here and there and you go to church a few times a year, that God's just going to let you into heaven because he likes all that stuff. And now that's a really dangerous ideology that can end up sending you to hell. And so having that, it's kind of one of the things about this show that's so cathartic for me is I can have a incendiary or unique topic in my brain, and then I get to just write an episode and then just, get it out. Just get to fart it out of my brain, and then it's done. And then I can move on to the next subject. And so that was this for me, but I'll get like an idea, and like within the week, the idea will be out on the podcast and I can move on. But I was dealing with this, as I was recovering for 3 or 4 months and having, little setbacks here and there and having to kind of figure out what I was going to do with my voice overall and, go through my coaching and all that. But to get all the way to that point, to build up to where I could feel confident to deliver that message to you, it really, really took a lot. But that was the episode I was most nervous about of 2023, episode 496, The Dangers of Country Music Theology. Now we're going to get into the audience's favorite interview of 2023. And so the only way to really do this fairly is to kind of break down the downloads of these different episodes and kind of rank them from there. And I know if it's earlier in the year, it gets more downloads and blah, 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 but these were kind of spread out. So number 3 audience favorite interview was episode 441 with John Cooper, and that was called Undaunted Cooper Life Stuff. And so that was him and I hanging out in Tulsa before their show up there. And so we recorded a podcast that went on both of our feeds. So that's why it's, Undaunted Life Cooper stuff. So Undaunted Cooper Life Stuff. And so that was number 3. Number 2 was my interview with Yeonmi Park. And so that was in episode 431. And so that's called A North Korean Defector's Search for Freedom in America. Excuse me. And that's another thing that episode was a long time coming as well, because it had been 2 or 3 years of work to secure that, and, kind of worked out with a release of a book and different things. But that was y'all's second favorite interview of the year. It's just fantastic. And then number 1 was episode 443 of this podcast with Joby Martin. So of all the interviews that we've done this year, that's the one that got the most amount of downloads. And so that's the interview that we did to support the release of his second book, Anything is Possible. And here's the interesting thing about that. Is he had already been on the show twice before. We did the first interview to discuss his first book, If the Tomb is Empty. And it was great. We hit it off, started a friendship, invited him back on. He did another episode. But there was something special about this particular episode that he and I, we kind of got a better feel for each other, and the way that we like to talk and the way that we like to cover subject matters. And we weaved in and out of different things that I wanted to weave in and out of. I challenged some things in his book, and he just, he chewed it up and spit it right back at me. And it was a really, really fun conversation. But here's the thing. I have fun conversations all the time that don't turn into high quality interviews, if I'm being honest. There are times when I do a really fun interview and I think it's awesome, but the audience is just kind of like, meh, they don't really care. But this was one where the audience was like all over it. The shares for it were through the roof, and people just really enjoyed what Joby had to say. And then springboard to what we're doing now, we have Ask a Pastor with Joby Martin. So once a month, Joby's going to come on the show, and I'm going to take questions from me, my internal circle here, and then also from our donors to ask him. So hey, if you wanted to ask a pastor a particular question that's maybe kind of a difficult question, what would you ask him? And this is one of the things that we've done. And it was because of episode 443, because y'all just enjoyed his opinions and the way that he brought it so much in that episode. I was like, we got to find a way to get him on the show more often. And so that's what we figured out. So that's the audience's favorite interview of 2023, episode 443, Joby Martin, and it's called Anything is Possible. All right, now let's break down the audience's favorite episode of 2023. So we're going to do the same thing. I just looked at the downloads, and we're going to go from 3 to 1. So number 3 was episode 408. That's the Forging Table, Galatians 1. So that was actually the very first Forging Table episode. So we had recorded that in 2022, and then we released that in January of 2023. So you guys loved that concept, and you still love the Forging Table even to today. So that was number 3. Number 2 was episode 423, Andy Stanley is a Heretic, for obvious reasons. And then number 1 was episode 410, the top 17 ways to avoid being a crappy man in 2023. So that is the episode that we do at the beginning of every year. I give you a certain number of ways to avoid being a crappy man. That's probably, the reason why that gets the most downloads is obviously it's released early in the year, but it's January, it's new year, new me people. It's people that are, finding podcasts, sharing podcasts, because, this is the year that I get my body in shape. And this is the year that I get my mind right. And this is the year that I fix my whatever. And so I kind of hit on a lot of those themes, and I've already prepared this episode. I'll be recording it to be released in early January. So that's always a very, very popular episode, but that was the audience's favorite episode of 2023, episode 410, the top 17 ways to avoid being a crappy man in 2023. Now we need to get to my favorites. Okay, so my favorite interview of 2023 and then my favorite episode of 2023. So I have some honorable mentions for my favorite interview. There's a lot. So what? Get over it. It's my show. So here are some of my favorite interviews from the year. Episode 530 with Sean Glass, 521 with Joby Martin, 520 with Tom Rayner, 514 with Os Guinness, 508 with Jay Warner Wallace, 506 with Vody Bauckham, 505 with Phil Robertson, 498 with Justin Brierly, 489 with Mike Dragich, 483 with Lucas Miles, 481 with Josh Hawley, 479 with Mike Glover, 477 with Tim Ballard, with the asterisk that, it's come to light that some of the stuff about his life is really not on the up and up. We're going to talk about that more later, but, it was a big podcast. I was glad to get it, so that's why I mentioned it. Keeping on here, 470 with Eugenia Constantinou, 462 with Jack Carr, 452 with Shane and Shane, 446 with Matt Greiner, 444 with Joby Martin, 441 with John Cooper, 440 with Ray Comfort, 437 with Holly McKay, 435 with Michael Franzese, 428 with Greg Hurwitz, 425 with Brandon Tatum, 422 with Josh Smith, 414 with Brittany De La Mora, 416 with Azizullah Aziz, and 415 with Chad Robichaux. But when I look at the year and I look at the dozens and dozens of interviews that we've done, And even when I look at the hundreds of interviews that we've done, there is one interview that stands out above them all, and that is my interview with Yeonmi Park. So that is the winner of the best interview, or my favorite interview of 2023. Again, it's episode 431, Yeonmi Park, a North Korean defector's search for freedom in America. So this is actually 2 years in a row where that award went to a woman. And so for a man's podcast, I sure do, have an affinity for some of my conversations with the ladies. But last year, that was with Sarah Wilkinson. So we talked a lot about her husband's suicide and, the things that she's done after that. And it was one of those interviews where I just, we were in tears within 5 minutes. Both of us were. I basically X'd out of my interview questions and I just said, hey, we're going to flow for the next 45 or 60 minutes and see where we go. But again, the Yeonmi Park interview, it was a long time coming. I had spent a lot of time being familiar with her story, reading her books, reading about the things that she had gone through and the things that she has done in order to literally get to America. And then to see, America erode around her and to see some of the same thoughts be popularized that remind her of the country that she literally left, North Korea, which is one of the worst dictatorships on the planet Earth right now, maybe even of all time. And I just remember at one point during the interview with her, again, you got to go back and listen to it. That's why I'm trying to be, somewhat short with all these descriptions. At one point of the interview, it may have been 20, 25 minutes in, I'm like, this is the best interview we've ever done. And it was because I'd spent a lot of time with the content. So my questions were on point, I felt. And she obviously lived that life. And she just talked about these crazy circumstances of her life in kind of this aw-shucksy, matter-of-fact way. And her answers, I loved them. Again, English is not our first language. And so some of it's a little bit hard to understand, but it was such an interesting thing to sit there and to be talking to a woman that weighs, 90 pounds and to realize she's probably one of the toughest gangsters maybe that's ever existed, because she goes into trafficking to be smuggled out of North Korea to get over to China. She endures crazy hardship, these thoughts that her and her mother might have to commit suicide, watching her mother be raped and finding out later it was because the man wanted to rape her, but the mother gave herself to him instead, to go through the desert of Mongolia in the middle of winter with basically a light jacket and bad shoes to try to get to the other side to have a chance at getting to South Korea, and then to go from South Korea to America. And just, I get frustrated when the Wi-Fi doesn't work. I don't like it when it's a little bit cold outside and I don't have the exact, right jacket on. And it's just like you look at someone like that and it's just an extreme level of toughness and an extreme level of something that we're very obsessed with, and that's resilience. I don't know that I know of a more resilient human that I've ever talked to than Yeonmi Park. So that is my favorite interview, not only of 2023, but that is my favorite interview that we've ever done on this show, and that's episode 431 with Yeonmi Park. Now we're going to do the last one here, the very last award. That is my favorite episode of 2023. And so I will give you some honorable mentions here. So episode 538, the Pope is an effeminate pansy, because he is. And literally within a week or two of me releasing that episode, he comes out with this declaration, even though Catholics say that he didn't declare it, but basically declaring that same-sex couples can get blessings from the church. And so that was something that I mentioned. I'm like, hey, before too long, he's going to have this. And then I was found out right, very, very quickly after. So here's some other honorable mentions. Episode 532, the song that changed my life. Episode 518, let those who love the Lord hate evil. Episode 512, Andy Stanley, the circle drawing snake. Episode 499, update, Andy Stanley is still a heretic. Episode 496, the dangers of country music theology. Episode 468, what if God doesn't heal me? Episode 438, preaching behind bars, you can still be free. Episode 432, my time with Jordan Peterson. Episode 426, the ugliness of gay adoption and surrogacy. And then 423, Andy Stanley is a heretic. Sorry, guys, I'm trying to sneak in my drinks and my coughs here, but having some issues with the throat and with the voice, but we're getting through it. But let's get to my last one here, the winner of my favorite episode of 2023. That's episode 408, The Forging Table, Galatians 1. This is the reason why. Took a risk. We took a risk adding a different thing to the podcast, because at the time, we've got my solo episodes, we've got my interviews, and, I would do random conversations. I think we had already launched From the Senate with Mark Wayne Mullen. Excuse me. We hadn't quite yet launched the Ask a Pastor with Joby Martin yet, but I was like, you know what? I read way too many books that were not the Bible in 2022. We need to fix that in 2023. Hey, we might as well teach, turn it into content. Hey, let's call it the forging table. Let me just set up a table with 4 mics, grab 3 other laymen, non-professional Christians. Let's just get around the table and let's take the Bible 1 chapter at a time, random books of the Bible, and let's just go chapter by chapter through different books and just talk about it for an hour. And I had no idea if it was going to work. None. The guys I pitched it to, they were like, yeah, I actually like that idea. I think that would be cool. But you never know. Your crew of 5 or 6 guys, you think something's cool, and then you like pitch it to somebody else, and they're like, yeah, that sounds kind of lame. And it's like, you're probably right. And so for us, we really liked the idea. But I initially was like, okay, let's just do the book of Galatians. And then if nobody liked it, and if it sucks, we just won't do it again, and we'll just pretend like it never happened. But even just preparing to record the first one, Galatians 1, I sent a text to all the guys, and I said, no, we're just doing this now. I don't care if no one listens to it. Like, I need this selfishly. I need to prepare as if I'm going to present on a chapter of the Bible. And I want to be surrounded by guys that are doing the same thing, that are spending time in the Word, marinating in the scriptures, the commentaries, the different, videos that are associated with that from other pastors or whatever. And I was like, we need this. And then immediately, the Forging Table episodes were getting more downloads than our normal episodes, and the audience could not have been more thrilled with it. And so we just like, okay, we're just going to do this now. And so I'm telling you, unless something major changes, we will be releasing a Forging Table episode every Sunday for as long as this show is going to be out. So if you skip those, I would encourage you not to do that. If you're a non-Christian listening to this, we're so happy that you're here. You need to see what it's like to have a group of normal dudes, just regular guys, sitting around talking about the Bible. So it's a very, very important episode to me because it was the very, very first one. But that's my favorite episode of 2023, episode 408, the Forging Table, Galatians 1. All right, guys, before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. So I've got links to the Origin and Jocko Fuel website. I got links to our donation page. I'm going to include links for the Joby Martin 443 interview, episode 410, the top 17 ways to avoid being a crappy man in 2023. And then a link to the Yeonmi Park interview and the very, very first Forging Table interview. Those links will be here for your convenience. And then everything else that I mentioned will just be here in the show notes, so you can check it out there. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And also, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.